Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are back looking at the Yugoslavian aviation tech tree, which was passed to developers in November 2020, and we're going to be having a look now at Soko. Soko is a company which is actually one which has created a lot of jet aircraft, mainly ground attackers or mainly counter-insurgency machines, and a lot of really interesting stuff, which is very interesting to go on, which is why this one gets its own little video. Now, Soko is actually the company that Ikarus goes into. The predecessor of this is obviously Ikarus, which we covered last time, and it was founded in the early 1950s, and it was defunct in the early 1990s. Basically, Soko means falcon in Serbian, so that's kind of where it gets its name, and it was created during 1950 by the relocation of the aircraft factory section of the Ikarus company from Zemun in Socialist Republic of Serbia. And by the 1980s, Soko was working on the Novi Avion project, which was intended to develop an indigenous fourth-generation supersonic multi-role fighter that would have enabled the Yugoslav Air Force to be supplied with domestically built modern fighters. And the production was planned to begin around 1991. But because of the outbreak of the Yugoslav wars and the enactment of an international arms embargo, this caused the project to be cancelled. So during the early years of the 1990s, the factory ceased aircraft production altogether, and this meant that the facilities were partially dismantled and relocated to Serbia, where they were aligned with the UTVA aviation industry. And UTVA is one of those other companies which we'll be having a look at in the next part. This part is just going to be solely looking at Soko, just because they have a ton of really interesting designs. So let's get started. Let's have a look at the first one, and the first one is a simple little machine. It is the Soko 552. The Soko 552 is a military trainer and light attack aircraft. It was produced in the 50s by Soko, and they actually made over 100 of these machines, which is pretty impressive. It was used for just over 20 years as the main trainer for many pilots for the Yugoslavian Air Force, and also in game it is one of those vehicles that would still be kind of useful, even if it had a few issues with it when it came to its overall power. This thing was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1340 AN1 Wasp air-cooled radial engine. This gave the thing 600 horsepower, meaning that the maximum speed of this machine was 351 kilometers an hour. And its armament isn't great, but it would be good enough for a rank 1 machine. It has two 7.9mm machine guns and could also carry 4 50-kilo bombs. So it has a little bit of secondary ordnance and also has the two main guns on it, which would be kind of fun. So yeah, it was pretty interesting. And also some of other things which are interesting about it. It gained some fame for its role in war movies filmed in Yugoslavia during the 60s and the 70s, where it was actually used to portray the Focke-Wulf 190 German fighter, and some of its prominent movie roles were in the Yugoslav Oscar candidate Battle of Neretva, and also Kelly's Heroes. So this thing was in Kelly's Heroes, which is definitely kind of interesting. The next vehicle is the Soko J20 Kraguj, and the Kraguj is another vehicle which is a little bit different from the 522. The 522 was, the 552, I apologize. Or is it 522? I mean, it's labeled as 552 in the forum post, but it's also labeled as the 522 when it comes to the actual articles on it. Maybe it's the 522, who knows. Anyway, so the next one is the J-20 Kraguj, and this machine is different from the trainer aircraft we just had a look at. This was much more designed around actual military work. There was around about 40 of them built, and it was a light military single-engine, low-wing, single-seat aircraft. It had a metal airframe that it was constructed from, and also it was designed for the close air support role and also counterinsurgency, and also a little bit of reconnaissance as well. This machine was used by Croatia. It was also used by the Republika Srpska, I'm sure that's how you see it, which is one of the two entities of Bosnia and also Herzegovina, and then also Yugoslavia. So this thing was used a little bit around the place. And with only 40 of them being built, this is technically a 60s aircraft. It was produced from 1964 to 1977, and it used a Wyoming GSO 480 B1A6 six-cylinder air-cooled horizontally opposed piston engine, which only had 340 horsepower. But you've got to understand that this thing was also an incredibly light vehicle, with its empty weight only being 1,100 kilos. Its maximum speed was 295 kilometers an hour, so once again, we're not breaking any speed records with this thing. And the general armament on it was two 7.7mm Colt Browning Mark II machine guns with 650 rounds each, and also it could carry two 12-round rocket packs or six 57mm or 127mm rockets, and also two 100-kilo bombs. So this thing would be able to carry a decent amount of ordnance, and also once again lacking in the main weapon departments, but that could be made up of at the end of the day. Another vehicle which, is a very light plane, not designed to go really fast, but designed to be able to deal with a very specific purpose, which is light ground attack. So yeah, quite nice to see. The next one is the Soko G2A Galeb. Now, the G2 Galeb is one of those machines which is a really interesting history. It is actually the first mass-produced jet aircraft that was made in socialist Yugoslavia, and it also served as the basis as many other machines that they would produce. The other thing that is cool about the G2 Galeb is it's actually it was designed to replace an American aircraft that was being used at the time by the Yugoslavs, the Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star, and the T-33 Shooting Star looks incredibly like the G2 Galeb, which also looks incredibly like the predecessor of the T-33 Shooting Star, which was the P-80/F-80 that we already have in game. So that's why you can maybe see some similarities between the two aircraft because of the fact that it's basically based off of it. So this one, obviously being a jet aircraft, it had a few variants that it was built from. As I said, it was the first mass-produced one. There was nearly 250 of these made, and it was produced between the mid-60s to the mid-80s, so about 20 years as it was, go around. 128 aircraft were used by the Air Force Academy for training new pilots, and also the second largest operator of the Galeb was actually Libya, which acquired over 100 of them during the 1970s. And then there was a small number which were acquired by Zaire, Zambia, and also Indonesia, showing that this thing had international, international acclaim. And the first version we're having a look at is the G2A. The G2A Galeb was powered by a DMB licensed built Rolls-Royce Viper ASV-11 Mark 22.6 turbojet engine. This thing had 11.12 kilonewtons of thrust, and also it had access to two 12.7mm guns in the nose with 80 rounds per gun. Yes, that's it. You only get 160 rounds with this thing, at least in its G2A setup, and also it would be able to carry a decent amount of bombs and rockets. It had 4 hardpoints on it and would be able to carry up to 300 kilos in capacity. So this means that it would be able to carry 50 or 100 kilo bombs. It would also be able to carry up to 250 kilo bombs, or 12 55 millimeter rockets, or of course 5 127 millimeters. The big thing about this vehicle is its top speed. The top speed was 812 kilometers an hour, making it a large step up from the Kraguj and also the 522 that we saw before. Then there were other models made of the Galeb. You basically had the A, the AE, the S, and the Galeb 3. Now, the next one on the list for the forum post is the Soko J2AL Galeb, which I'm guessing is supposed to stand for late, and I think it's supposed to be a slightly different version of it, but basically it's the same as the previous model, but it would have much more ordnance options. So my guess is a later variant of it, which was just able to carry many different things, which would make it a little bit more combat effective in the game itself. Then you have the next one, which is the TJ21 Jastreb, and the never mind. The J21 Jastreb, there we go, that's the one we're on, instead of the other one. Now, this is another vehicle which is developed as a replacement of another American vehicle, which the Yugoslavs used. So, at the time, the Yugoslavians used the F-84 Thunderjet, but they wanted to make a domestically produced aircraft, which they were able to, basically replace it with. And that is what the J-21 Jastreb actually is. It is a vehicle which was a single-seat, single-engine, light attack aircraft. You can see the theme here when it comes to the Soko stuff. Pretty much all of them are either trainers or attack aircraft or ground attack aircraft, and it was designed by the Aeronautical Technical Institute and also the VTI, which is the Vojno-Technic Institute, Beograd, and in Belgrade, and it was manufactured by Soko in Mostar. This thing was derived from the machine we just looked at, the G2 Galeb, the advanced jet trainer and also light attack aircraft, and it was produced in a decent amount of numbers. They produced over 200 of these things, 224 in general, and once again produced from the 60s to the 70s, basically the mid-60s to the mid-70s, and did definitely be used by a ton of different operators. Libya really liked this one again, and then also, you had the Zaire and also Zambia who were using this thing. So yeah, the fact that it was based off of the F-84 Thunderjet, which is pretty cool, and also you had the Type 1B ejection seats which were put in this thing, which was pretty interesting. But basically the Jastreb had access to the BMB Rolls-Royce Bristol Siddeley Viper Mark 531 turbojet engine. This gave it a little bit more power than the G2. It had 13.32 kilonewtons of thrust, and also it was designed, just like a lot of these aircraft were, they were designed for a short runway takeoff or a very, very rough runway takeoff. That's why, with the Kraguj, it was so light, and it was designed to just be able to get up into the air quickly, and one of the things that they did for the J21 here to try and make that a reality is they gave it access to JATO, so you could actually attach 2 JATO rockets to this thing to get it off the ground quicker. And then also, if you have a look, at the fact that it had this more powerful engine, it was obviously a lot heavier than stuff that they'd made before. This meant that this vehicle had 820 kilometers an hour of maximum speed, which is pretty nice, And then also the armament options were expanded from previous models, such as the G2. So 3 12.7mm Browning machine guns, always nice to have. There was 135 rounds per gun as well on top of that. And then it had 8 hardpoints, meaning that you could put a ton of different stuff on it. So you could put some napalm tanks on it if you wanted. You could put some rocket pods on it. You could put a bunch of different bombs on it. That, to me, is always pretty good. The inboard pylons had a capacity of 250 kilos. The outboard pylons had a capacity of 50 kilos, and you could just basically chuck a bunch of stuff on it as well. So yeah, another jet attacker from the Yugoslavs. The next one is the TJ-21 Jastreb, which is one I mentioned earlier. And the only difference between this and the J-21 is this one has 2 seats. So yeah, there you go. That's it. The next one is the Soko RJ-21, and this is another of the J-21 series, and you want to know the difference between this one and the previous two? Ah yes, it has tactical reconnaissance equipment, and that's it. Great. So basically that's 3 of the same aircraft, at least in terms of the game. Moving on to an actual vehicle, we have the Soko G3 Galeb 3, and this was a prototype of what they were trying to work on going into what we'll look at as the G4. This was a prototype derived from the G2A, and basically what they did is they took the engine from the J21, the Rolls-Royce Bristol Siddeley Viper Mark 532 turbojet engine, which obviously, you know, we talked about it was more powerful than the one that was used in the standard G2 Galeb, and they installed it on the G2 Galeb. That's pretty much what they did. So they went from 11.12 kilonewtons of thrust to the 13.32 kilonewtons of thrust. So, you know, that's quite a big difference for the machine itself. And also they added more modern equipment to it, and also they added the JATO to it, the jet-assisted takeoff, and also doubled the ordnance. But obviously this was a prototype, and it was generally seen, you know, as a success, and eventually it would morph into what we know as the G4. So the G4 is the Super Galeb. So we've gone from the Galeb to the Super Galeb now. And the Super Galeb, there was around about 80 of them produced. This was produced from the mid-80s to the early 90s. And then, unfortunately, when one of the things that stopped its production was, well, the Yugoslav wars. And that's, you know, very sad for the machine itself, and also Soko, which was broken up after it. But it did actually take part in the Yugoslav wars. A total of 4 were recorded as having been lost to enemy air defenses, and during 1992, the remaining aircraft were relocated to Serbia and Montenegro, where they entered service with the Air Force of the newly formed Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And there was a single G4 that was left over for the Republika Srpska Air Force, and the Serbian Air Force would become the largest operator of the type, having acquired further Super Galebs from other ex-Yugoslavian republics. So the Super Galeb, as I said, it's just a very large upgrade over the G2 and the G3. It was re-engined. They gave it a much better engine, the Viper Mark 623-46. This gave it a top speed of 920 kilometers an hour. They also changed the machine guns out, and they were replaced with the GSH-23L 23mm cannons, and they had 100 rounds. They also improved the secondary ordnance options. They were vastly improved in variety. You could have 50 cal gun pods, you could have up to 250 kilo bombs, cluster bombs. You could also have 4 launchers for either 55mm, 827mm, or 128mm unguided rockets. So this thing had access to a ton of different things to it, which would have been absolutely lovely. And then we have the G4M. The G4M is a further upgrade of the G4, and this added a bunch of different stuff to it. It upgraded the avionics and the hardpoints of the vehicle. They added missile rails to the wingtips. The avionics would include the Zrak ENP MG4 hood, incorporating a Rudy Kayevek ENS MG4 electronic sight, a gyro platform, multifunction displays, and also an optional chaff flare dispenser on the machine. The inner hardpoints would be rated at 500 kilos, the outer ones at 350 kilos, and this gave the maximum disposal load of 1800 kilos for the vehicle. You could also carry a bunch of different stuff on it. The normal takeoff weight for this vehicle was 4,971 kilos as a trainer, and the takeoff weight as an attacker configuration would be 6,400 kilos. The maximum speed in clean configuration was 865 kilometers an hour, and it had a ferry range of around about 2,900 kilometers for drop tanks and a range of 1,800 kilometers with standard fuel, reduced to 1,200 kilometers with a cannon pack, 4 cluster bombs, and also 2 AAMs. So this thing was able to carry pretty much anything that it wanted. It was powered by the Rolls-Royce Viper 63246 turbojet with 17.8 kilonewtons of power, so they didn't actually change the actual engine itself from the standard G4, but they just upgraded it internally and made it so it could, carry a bunch of other stuff. Being able to carry up to 500 kilos of bombs, and the main thing with the missile rails, it was either able to support 2 R-60s, 2 R-60 MKs, or 2 R-73Es, which I think would be really interesting to see in the game. This, to me, is a very, very powerful machine, depending on what BR they wanted to put it at. And then the next one is the J-22A Orao, and now this is a twin-engined subsonic ground attack and aerial reconnaissance aircraft, and it was developed and built in collaboration by Soko in Yugoslavia, but it was also helped develop by Aviation and Kraguj, which were from Romania, and that would eventually turn it into the IR-93 Vultur, if you know what that is. It's a very, very interesting machine. And the J-22, it was introduced in the late 70s, with its first flight being in the early 70s, and produced between the 70s and also the early 90s. And it went through many different variants, but this one, the standard J-22 that we have, that would have access to the Orao/Turbo Mechanica built Rolls-Royce Viper Mark 633-47 turbojet. This gave it 17.79 kilonewtons of thrust if it was on dry, and also this machine did have an afterburning version, which we'll get into very, very soon. But this thing was able to go this version was able to go 1,000 kilometers an hour at sea level. It was also armed with 2 23mm GSH-23L cannons, and overall had 200 rounds per gun, so that means 400 rounds in total. And just like the Super Galeb, it would be able to carry a bunch of secondary ordnance loadouts, but not just air-to-airs and also rockets, also air-to-ground missiles. This thing could actually carry Mavericks, and it could also carry Groms, the KH-66 Groms, which is pretty interesting. These were based off the Soviet KH-23, which was around at the time. It had 5 hardpoints in total and definitely could pack a punch. The next vehicle was the J-22AE Orao 1. Now this was the same as the J-22A, but it had once again tactical reconnaissance equipment. So that's the only thing to say about that one. The Orao 2 is where we get a big push for a very interesting machine. This thing had an afterburner with it. It had increased performance on it, Basically, it made it equivalent to the IAR-93B that was around at the time. It also had integral wing tankage, greater weapons load and diversity than the standard Orao 1, and also it used a Thomson CSF hood. It was only built in single-seat form though, and the production of the AB totaled 165 aircraft, and they planned a major upgrade with radar and computer, nav and attack systems, which would be integrated via the MIL STD 1553 digital data bus, but the dissolution of Yugoslavia ended the plans, unfortunately. So this meant only 57 aircraft were actually delivered before production ceased, and not all were up to full J-22 Orao 2 standard, and an additional 42 aircraft were ordered but were never actually delivered. And so that's a bit of a problem with it, but at least a few were made. This thing, its top speed would increase from 1,050 kilometers an hour to 1,130 at sea level, and once again, as we talked about, more modern avionics, more variety of ground attack options, and would be able to break the sound barrier in a dive, which is pretty nice, and also had the same main armament with the two 23mm cannons with 400 rounds in total. Then we have the J1 Jastreb. This one is an intermediate the J21 Jastreb. It was developed from the G2 Galeb, and it performed like the Galeb but had 3 machine guns with a lot more ammo and better ordnance options. So that's basically the last vehicle that is on the list, just to show you guys. So you can see that Soko made a lot of very interesting aircraft, obviously a lot of ground attack ones, and they just got better and better and better as they went along, and just made a ton of really cool stuff, and I'm very happy to be able to have a look at them with you today. But anyway, that is part 3 done. We'll have a part 4 looking at the other 2 sets, and then we'll be done with this wonderful tech tree. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hosest Kishot, Hans, Barine, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.